All right, we're going to go ahead and get started if we can. Don't make me do it a third time.
You want to do that thing? If you can hear me, clap your hands twice.
No, I don't. All right, welcome. Thank you for being here for something of an experimental presentation called Critical Cartography, Necropolitics, and Curriculum Inquiry, a Conversation. My name is Rob Helfenbein, and I am at Mercer University. And part of the book, or the discussion will be around my 2021 book, Critical Geographies of Education, Space, Place, and Curriculum Inquiry.
And I'm Boni I am a professor at Penn State Abington, and the conversation is around my 2023 book, Educational Necropolitics, a Sonic Ethnography of Everyday Racisms in U.S. Schools.
Great. So our intention with this session, rather than each present on our recent books, is to put the two works into conversation to see what might be generative in the doing so. Certainly the dialogic has a long history in curriculum theorizing, and both of us pull from scholars both shared and disparate and have our own reads as to what that work helps us do. The goal isn't consensus, but rather exploration. So to that end, we've shared some questions we have with each other, but not necessarily the answers, because it's more fun that way. And we intend to do both a bit of reading and improvised response. We thought we might focus on two concepts that appear, both explicitly and implicitly, in both of our work: critical geography/cartography and necropolitics, all within a larger frame of curriculum inquiry. But again, we enter this quite comfortable with not knowing where it's going to lead. So I'll start.
I should explain that part of the framework here about reading and improvising has been completely improvised now since my computer is not working, which contains all of my notes for this session. So bear with me.
It's going to be good. All right. All right. One of the things about these two books is that they're both, at least in a way, a return to previous scholarship, a rethinking or reanalysis of sorts. I wonder if we might start with some thoughts on that somewhat luxurious opportunity to return to previous work and some reflection on what was new in that rethinking.
Okay. So for me, educational necropolitics came from my dissertation data. And when we say it was a return to it, it's actually data that I did as a doctoral student, and it was just too fraught for me. I had to actually set it aside. So if you look at my publications since then, it doesn't include this data set at all. There's just too much trauma associated with it, and I just couldn't bring myself back to it. I had to completely walk away. So I graduated in 2015. I started looking at it again, or I started thinking about looking at it again in 2021. And thinking maybe I should do something with that little project I did that got me my degree. Something. And so I decided, rather than doing the move that a lot of people do, which is to turn your dissertation straight into a book, I just looked at the data as if I had tried to the best of my ability, as if I had not seen it before. So I listened to every sound file. It's a sonic ethnography. So everything's recorded. I immersed myself back in those sounds and the associated coding structure with sonic ethnography, and then asked myself, like, what are my findings, did the analysis, and then reread my dissertation and said, do I still agree with myself several years later? And the answer was sometimes. And sometimes not. And some of it was, there was this thread that I didn't pay near enough attention to. So how does that reposition me now that I understand what I understand at this moment? So it was, for me, coming back to this data, on one hand, was important. Another reason that I had set it aside was because the trauma of my participants was so clear that they spoke about not wanting things to be published for a while, because they were worried about the repercussions that might come and hit them. Because although we de-identify data, when it's the sonic ethnography and you can hear voices, there's a challenge that's associated there. So it was really, on one hand for the participants, on the other hand for me, just to have some time away from it. But I think it gave me a valuable understanding about what I thought I knew at the time, and what I think I know now. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, nice. So as I thought about the question, I don't think I knew all that. So that is helpful to think about the ways in which the book kind of came to be, or maybe just emphasis, right? But when I thought about this too, I mean, it is a difficult. Well, one, it's always hard to look at older work. One, because you find that typo that you missed in the journal. You're like, oh my God, But that's one thing. But it also is hard too, because sometimes you look at what you like. Did I really think that? Did I say that? So it is difficult to do that. But I think there is something luxurious as well. Like there's an intellectual project that's kind of pleasant, right, in going back and rethinking or thinking again, right? And so as I think about that, I'm very interested in, and there's folks in the room that have heard me say similar things, but I'm interested in generative spaces, right? And so like where are the places where there's opportunities for us to think again? Right, or to take a new question and to say, well, I'm not sure I thought about it that way, right, in a particular way. And so I'm interested in that as a generative thing. And just a short aside, I think, this is the part you've heard me say, but I think one of those generative spaces is the Bergamo Conference. And it still is one of those places where people talk about their work, what they're reading, what's happening, what's new and exciting. And it's always been that for me. And so I think finding those spaces as a scholar are pretty important. And the short story is, I remember, invariably somebody will ask me, well, what are you reading? Right? And several years ago, quite a few years ago now, but I remember somebody said, what are you reading? And Spivak had just put out that book on globalization and aesthetic education. And I said, well, I just got that new Spivak. And 2 or 3 other people said, oh, I wanted to read that, or I got it too, I haven't started it, or I'm halfway through, or something like that. This is all on the back patio, right, over bad wine and little hunks of cheese, right, as you do, right? And that turned into, it's like, well, let's read it, and let's read it together. And that turned into a panel the next year, right, where we each, it was also kind of in the same spirit, we each took a chapter of the Spivak book and wrote a response to a different chapter, but we didn't share the chapters with each other before the panel. So in the panel itself, it was like, I don't know what they're going to say, right? So that was kind of exciting too. Very well received, and it ended up being, I think, literally the first special issue dedicated to Spivak in education, right? And so that's a generative space. And part of why I bring it back is because what I ended up writing in that chapter is graduate students for a long time would ask me, what's the hardest thing you ever read, right? Because for some, I'm the one that assigns the hard stuff, right? So like, okay, so what's the hardest thing you ever tried to read? And for a long time, my answer was Spivak, and it was Critique of Postcolonial Reason. And what I did in that chapter was go back, because I still had my copy, from grad school, which still had my notes in the margin, and my question marks, and my exclamation points, and my WTFs, and and I even had some typed up notes, right? And I'm going to land this plane, I promise. But what I found was it was very interesting to read the new Spivak collection, kind of alongside my old notes on, 10 years ago, trying to read Critique of Postcolonial Reason, and realizing in many ways that I wasn't ready for it then. And I'm ready for it now, right? So I kind of bring up this idea of being ready to the work, and I kind of heard that in your answer too, is needing to step away a little bit from some of those data, right? And finding a space where you could come back to it.
So I'm wondering, actually I think it might be beneficial if we just give a little synopsis of each book, if you haven't had the opportunity to engage
Sure.
Would you like to start with that?
I think you should start.
Oh, all right. So I had, it was a 2-year ethnographic project. It was working with students of color in an overwhelmingly white suburban school district in the Midwest. I think you said over ridiculously white at some point in your career, and I love that term.
Yeah, I coined the term RWI, ridiculously white institution.
So when I say overwhelmingly or ridiculously white, the school district at that point in time was 96% white, and they consider that far more diverse, quote unquote, than what it was in the past. So I worked for 2 years. My initial part of the study, I worked full time as a K-12 teacher while I was doing my doctorate work. And I'm coming down the stairs. It's a really long building. And when I say long, I mean it's a half mile from one end of the building to the other end of the building. Rather than build 2 school buildings, they just built onto the existing structure. And the copy room is at the other end of the building from where my classroom was at the time. And so I'm coming down the stairs, and a group of young men are standing there, and they said, "Hey, Mrs. Wozliak, we're going to start a war of the half-breeds, and we want you to be our half-breed leader." And I said, "Whoa, let's talk about that," right? And I said, "What
Say
was
more.
Say more about that." And they said, "Well, you're the only half-breed teacher in the school." I said, "By that you mean biracial?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay." And I'm looking around, and I said, "Do you all identify as biracial?" They said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay." And I said, "I'm looking at you. I'm identifying you as young men." And they said, "Well, yeah, the girls are down there. They have their own thing." And I said, "Okay, all right." And this is, as we talk about ethnographic data for me, which was the rich point in what is going on here. It's a district that I had worked in for 7 years. I had just sort of kept my head down and worked to the best of my ability. It's a district that for all 7 years I had a lawyer on retainer because the amount of times that I was positioned to need the lawyer. I ran a Genders and Sexualities Alliance that I identify as a queer woman of color, and the amount of times that I had administrators up in my room saying, "If you just drop the queer thing, your life will be better." And I said, I will not be doing that anytime soon. And so my focus was really on the queer students in the building, and not necessarily even thinking about how students of color were negotiating this context, because for me it was just keep your head down and survive, and not go to jail, actually. And yes, it got that severe sometimes. So I worked for 2 years with these students, and the preliminary findings for me is what I called educational choking and lynching. It was borrowing from previous work. If you think about Carter G. Woodson's quote, where he says, "There would be no lynching if it first did not start in the schoolroom." And thinking about that line across the African American intellectual traditions, and thinking about what this meant for students. And for me, what really pushed me towards that is I had a student who came into my classroom one day, and she said, "Hey, I was listening to this musician, and her name is Billie Holiday. Have you heard of her?" And I said, "Yes, I have heard of Billie Holiday." And she said, "I was listening to it with my grandmother, and there's this song called Strange Fruit." And she said, "Have you heard that one?" And I said, "I have heard that one." And she said, "Well, as I was listening to it, it struck me that we are the strange fruit of the school. And they don't care if we rot or if we die. They just want us out of the way, essentially." And so for me, for me, that really sort of started to push at how do we understand ontoepistemological death? What does it look like as it's happening in real time? It's 2015. I'm reading about the school-to-prison pipeline. At the same time, I'm writing about the school-to-coffin pipeline for queer and questioning youth, and thinking about what are the intersections therein. And so the data set follows that from a sonic lens, sonic ethnography, pushing at how we understand Western traditions that really focus on the ocular, and what does it mean to have other understandings, in this case coming from the sonic, both in theory and in method, right? So how do we understand reverberations as they happen in our lives from a theoretical standpoint? How can we understand them in a very material standpoint, right? So those are the pieces and parts of this study, which then turned into, later as I looked at the data again, how do I understand educational necropolitics as they function in schools? I want to be really clear, I'm not the first person to talk about this, right? more recently, I found a lot of value in leaning on Lance McCrady's work and Bettina Love's work for these things, particularly when Dr. Love talks about spirit murdering. And so what I did is I was really returning to that and then Mbembe's work and Puar's work and saying, what does it look like on a day-to-day basis and how does this function in schools? So that we can name it and then think about what interrupting it looks like.
Nice. So, so my book was, well, one, I don't know if this is, I'm not sure if this is true anymore. I don't know, but I was strongly advised as a young pre-tenured faculty member to not write a book. I was told very clearly that peer-reviewed articles were the coin of the realm, and don't do it. Get tenure, and then do it, right? It was real clear. This was at Indiana University, and so I ignored some of that and did a bunch of I did some edited books, right? But I didn't do the book. And I started getting a bit frustrated because I continually was doing what I think is what curriculum theory is, which is reading outside of the field to see what useful tools we might find to apply to the field, right? And so I had found this thing called critical geography, or it had found me, how you want to think about that. And I kept having to explain it. I kept having to define it. So at some point I knew, like, I just got to write the book, and then I can just cite it, right? And so when you question, so I don't have to write that damn thing again, and and I can just say, go read the book, right? Like, there it is. So I knew I wanted to do it, but I was very, I was struggling with how to put it together, and how to go back to that, at this point, dissertation data, which is not all the book, but it's kind of the first part of it. And that was now, 20 years past. And so what does one do with that, right? But I liked the idea of rethinking it again. And did I have some better tools, maybe, to understand what was there? And then, and I mentioned this earlier, so sorry if folks heard this, but then I literally had something of an epiphany, that I think it kind of is an epiphany. And the idea was that, well, we talk about intellectual histories all the time, right? And I've always liked intellectual histories, and they're interesting, how ideas develop over time. And I was like, yeah, but what about intellectual geographies? So how do ideas shift over space and place, right, instead of just time? And for me, that was the complete light bulb epiphany moment where I was like, that's what this book is going to be. It's going to be an intellectual geography. Right, and it's going to start with my dissertation, right, and then it's going to move through different places and the type of work that I still used, kind of critical spatial analysis, critical geographic tools, cultural studies, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But I did them, and it looked different as I moved to different places, right, and so that became the way to frame the book, and so that part, I just in case you need a little context, is that the dissertation was about an after-school computer lab that was actually across the street from a high school that I taught in. So I knew the high school very deeply, but I had already left, and I was in my doctoral program. And it was about this computer lab that was loosely affiliated with the school, right? And I didn't know much about it when I was a teacher across the street, right? And again, I didn't know how much, now I had a geography background, so it's not crazy that it came up, but I didn't know how important that was going to be until I started talking to kids, or really listening to kids, because I did an ethnographic dissertation as well, where I didn't do any formal interviews for 6 months. I stayed in the place, and I often talk about, I sat on the front porch, the front steps for a month, right, just to see who's coming in and out, because there's a lot of action on those front steps, right? Short point being is that what happened then is I realized when they did talk about what was happening, my favorite research question, of course, is, what's going on here? That's literally my favorite research question. But and so, really, what's going on, right? But they would talk in these spatial terms, and it was always, well, here we can do this, but there, and there was the high school, right? And they framed this in a binary, right? That was real clear in their head, right? but that to me was also so very clearly spatial. So then I got to figure out, what does here mean, right? And so that became the impetus for that. Last thing I might say about this question too, though, is, and not to I'm not going to do a lot of Foucault here, right? But Foucault, you might know, is kind of famously, scholars divide into early, middle, your favorite, early, middle. You use a lot more Foucault now, by the way. You do, you do.
Damn it.
She used to talk smack about Foucault. Early, middle, and late Foucault is usually how scholars talk about Foucault. And there's a great interview at one place where the interviewer, smarty pants interviewer, kind of asks him about that and the differences, and is this an inconsistency or whatever. And Foucault brilliantly says something like, what kind of thinker would I be if I thought the same thing now that I did then? Right? Which is pretty amazing. And then he does the killer, right? That's also where he does the killer line. It's like, I'll tell you what, right? As far as me and my papers, I'll leave it for you and the police to sort it out. How do you not love that guy? I mean, that's crazy. Okay.
Okay. Just let me borrow your notes. All right. Okay. So another place where these books intersect is the use of ethnographic data to think about critical geography, necropolitics, and curriculum. The findings, as one might imagine, feel divergent. For example, in Chapter 3, you focus on places of possibility, where my work tends to focus on places where harm is consistently emergent. I'm wondering if we might talk more about these braided ideas of theory and method and how they've shaped our work, our findings, and how we approached the discussions of this work throughout the books.
Okay. This is where it might get good.
He wasn't good before?
Right?
Fair. No. Okay. Okay, so I think that they are indeed divergent, at least for the first half of the book. But it may have something to do with the positionality of the analysis, or, if you will, the point of origin of the inquiry. I say this because I'm really curious to see what you think about these ideas.
Yeah, I'm listening.
In my case, yeah, thanks. In my case, the culture enabled and supported at the well, that was the name for the computer lab, right? The culture enabled and supported at the well was the object of analysis, and was quite notably not the school across the street, right? Now, I had to talk a little bit about that, because that's the way the kids did, but the object of analysis was the well. I argue that it was a space of possibility, right? A counter space, a place to be otherwise. Ethnography, and specifically post-critical ethnography, via my mentor, George Noblet, was always going to be method for me. But that was even a stronger pull as George sent me off to cultural studies to, quote, get more theory. Process that for a minute. Like, you got to get out of the school of ed. No, but anyway, so therefore, given ethnography and kind of that cultural studies thing, I was thinking about culture all the time. By the way, he called me a theory guy. That's what he called me that one time. And I was pretty sure that it wasn't a compliment. Right? But I always took it as a caution against kind of the seductions of theory, of how we can get caught up and seduced in the elegance, right, of theoretical work. But it might be important to stress here that culture, as understood by the Birmingham School, and here I mean Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy, John Clark, and the hugely important for me Doreen Massey, who's a geographer, by the way. Culture is a process, not a thing. It is an unending negotiation between people and the world, and that very powerful notion unlocks the ability to see wins and steps towards freedom, partial, tentative, even fleeting though they may be. Relatedly, I had already started saying that I didn't want to write another story of failed urban school reform. I wanted to find place and practice that worked for kids, that everybody wrote off. And it seemed to me that the well was one of those places. I'm reminded here, too, of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's comment that freedom is a place. She says, freedom as a place means we combine resources, ingenuity, and commitment to produce the conditions in which life is precious for all. So no matter the struggle, freedom is happening somewhere. Through different forces and relations to power, the people are constantly figuring out how to shift, how to build, how to consolidate the capacity for people to flourish, to mobilize our communities, and to stay in motion until satisfied. So the point here is, though in these scholars we see resistance and the possibility in struggle, we can see the materiality of these spaces of possibility, study how they work, maybe even embark on making more of them. To be clear, I'm not saying that you don't share some of those commitments as well, just that this is where they came from for me. I might note as well that more recent work, and here I'm thinking about, and it's in the book, but some other things, but I'm thinking about the work on Baltimore, right? My previous institution before Mercer was Loyola University, Baltimore. And that begins to rethink, or at least reconfigure, these ideas a bit, and may even be aligned with necropolitics. Again, I'm curious to see what you think. I noticed that I tended to think with the idea of spaces of possibility. This is me thinking back over 20 years of scholarship, right? One of the things I noticed in that luxurious looking back, right, that I tended to think about spaces of possibility as not guaranteed, sure. That's why I say possibility. They're not guaranteed. They're not determined. But I thought of them usually in positive ways. Thinking about the very material cartographies of exclusion and racial confinement in Baltimore through a very long and frankly well-documented history and geography, right? But thinking through those material cartographies of exclusion and racial confinement challenged that framing, and even the efficacy of neoliberal understanding of cities, right? And so, when people talk about neoliberalism, they talk about it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. But there's places in Baltimore that are excluded, right? That are pushed out, that are bounded off, right? In ways that I think we may not be thinking hard enough about. So there, and I also leaned heavily on the work of Saskia Sassen and her idea of expulsions. And again, I don't think she uses Mbembe, but there is certainly a question of who is disposable and who is not. As to the question more specifically, the positionality of the inquiry for me was one of outside looking in, starting outside the school. Did open up understandings of the school as very much a place where, for certain kids, quote, harm was consistently emergent, as you say. That's who these kids were. That's who the kids who came to the well were. But again, given the affordances above, I choose to speak more to the ingenuity and commitment following Gilmore of what I was seeing in those kids. Your study, of course, was from the inside itself and may have brought those harms into much, much sharper relief. How could it not? I wonder what you think of that. But I also wonder if you sell yourself short a little bit, as it seems to me that your classroom could be thought of as a space of possibility, but it might have been awkward to think about it or write about it in that way.
So, yes. And I actually do write about that. I don't know, somewhere around chapter 4 or 5, I think. And so for me, it's the tension. One of the tensions that is expressed here is following up on my work that I've done on what I call an assemblage of violence. Mm-hmm. So how do we think about violence as it's interconnected to different things? And I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole, but my first book, there's a moment where I really had to ask myself how I understood hope as it's in connection to different forms of violence, particularly in that data set, in that instance, for queer middle school youth of color, right? And so in these moments, it's what does it mean to say that things like hope and love exist, but very much in a Laurent Berlant, Sarah Ahmed sort of ways, how are they intra-connected to other possibilities? And so while my classroom was a place where students just sort of came and hang out and they would eat lunch and all those things happened, absolutely, but it's still within a system, right? And what happens when there is no outside of power? Not going to quote anyone there. It's
He's French.
He's French. Surprise, here he comes again.
Early, middle, all right.
But for me, like leaning back onto Sherry Ortner's work too, as to how these different power dynamics get expressed, right? And she does use Foucault there, but also thinking about James and Smith and other folks who think about power relations differently. And when we're thinking about the affective relationships, what does that mean in spaces of possibility? What does that mean in spaces of violence? And then how do we do them justice, right? Because I don't want to let go of one for the other. And that, for me, feels precarious. When you have students who are describing very clearly to me what it means to have ontoepistemological death and dying, to sit in that tension becomes all the more difficult. But at the same time, there are so many other facets that need to be celebrated, right? And so I think it's not that I sell myself short. It's not that I don't talk about it. I absolutely do. Yeah. But I think in these moments, I don't want to over-represent one thing for another. And I want to be really careful about what that means as it's interlocated.
That's a beautiful answer. It's a tension that we can't quite resolve.
Right. Singh talks about it in terms of friction, too, and I find that language very helpful to me. And the metaphor that she specifically uses is like a tire on the road, right? And it's productive. Friction is productive in some way, shape, or form. Although the road gets worn down over time, right? The tire gets worn down much more quickly. I've talked about that in terms of what I call agentic contingencies, right? What are the contingencies under which we can exercise our agency? But thinking about that in terms of the system, a classroom that is a space of possibility and hope also exists within this broader system. And that's not to say that administrators were not in there all the time interrupting those spaces of possibility. And that's part of the line that I feel like I'm walking sometimes.
Nice. That's great. That's so good. That idea of friction, and I agree, like that. It's the introduction of that book, Friction, that she lays out, this theory. And so the idea, we tend to either think of the tire or the road, right? When it's the friction that's where it's at, right? And so there's kind of an agency structure debate happening there that she's wrestling with. So good. Thank you. So I see you as one of the preeminent education scholars working with affect theory. And I'm wondering how that's evolved over time. Would you say that revisiting of these data drew you to more affect in your analysis? Also, I'm quite interested in your thoughts on critical geographies and affect, as it seems to me like there's more work to do on this. And as a theoretical intersection, right? There's more work to be done as an intersection of two things, i.e., bodies are necessarily in places, places and affects, power, place, affect, etc.
Yeah.
2 questions.
It's a lot of questions. That's more than 2.
Who's counting?
Who's counting? Me. Now, it is one of those things that over time has, I've come to it and struggled with it quite a bit. I don't know how many of you have engaged with the Affect Theory Reader, 2010 with Seaworth and Gregg. Amazing starting point for the field, frankly. I know that they're now doing an update on that reader, which should be out pretty soon here. I think for me, affect became this tool to wrestle with the soft things that could not be named in context, in and across contexts. And I found myself sort of returning to that more and more as my scholarly trajectory has shaped up the way that it has. And at the same time, making sure that I don't over-identify. Affect cannot account for everything, or affect theory, right? And at the same time, it is a part of everything we do in those relations and relationships. And so I feel with this second iteration, I was able to name things a little bit more clearly than I was before. But I want to be honest, what allowed me to name things differently this time around was the intersection of affect theory, although it's not called that in their work all the time, but affect theory and critical geography. And I'm thinking here specifically like Christina Sharp's work, and others who, Alexander Wahilier, who are able to, Catherine McKittrick, who are able to really sort of have these clear conversations about geography and space and place and how that affects and is affected. And I think it was the reading, right? Going back to your original point, I wasn't ready for all of that yet. in ways that I have been over time. And so I think as I revisited and looked at that intersection, part of the piece, what I did with the students in my original study is I had them map the school. I had these grand plans about getting the blueprint of the school and then having these little sound files, and you could literally like scroll through the school and hear the different sounds and what does a cafeteria sound like, all those sorts of things. And then I didn't do that because sometimes you need to finish the dissertation, as it turns out. And so, I started really thinking, so there is a geography component to this as well that is also very sonically based. I bought these really crappy recorders, and the reason I bought the crappy recorders, not the really strong ones, is because I didn't want students putting them in their pocket. This is an ethnographic study. This is not like surprise journalism. And so they had to sort of like awkwardly hold them in their hands, which was weird at first, but as 2 years went over, like sort of came around, people stopped paying attention to the kids walking like this, right? And I have one particular, it was a 20-minute clip where I had students mapping the building, and I asked them just to go out and tell me, the first round, tell me what you want to about school, right? That's it. And so what was interesting to me is you hear them walking, oh, I'm not going to talk about this place, or this is not important to me, or this is where I hang out. I need to go into the art room. Hold on one second. Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, can I come in here and talk about your room with the teacher right there? This is a horrible room. They treat me badly there. Here I'm thinking like, okie dokie, that's a bold choice, since you're still in the class right now. But, what was interesting is I have this one clip, and it is 3 young men of color who are walking through the building, and the amount of times that they get stopped with escalating anger in the tones it's not surprising, but to hear it effectively was different, right? And so what I did, I was on a plane to Luxembourg, and I put all the clips of teachers and administrators yelling at kids, like back to back, like I layered them just to see like what I felt and what I heard, and then I gave myself a migraine actually. But really, like, how do we understand these affective tensions as they get expressed through critical geography and then through sonic ethnography as that second layer? And then what it is in the literatures that allowed me to have that conversation differently. So in your case, talking about spaces of possibility, what does it mean to have hope and possibility in a separate place than, as the students, it sounds like, are defining it as a separate place from where they go for the learning, right? So we think about what is the formal curriculum of that.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, I feel like your book is more affect theory than you give it credit for. And I'm wondering then a question back, which is not on this list, sorry, but is how you feel your work as I've watched you over time. I think I just graduated. You said, like, what are you reading on affect theory? And then we went to the affect theory conference. And so I've watched you sort of come to it in different ways. Yeah. And I'm wondering how that's sort of impacted, or it continues to impact, right, the work and findings that you're doing.
Thanks for that. Yeah. I do feel like I came late to affect theory. I felt like, and I think it largely, I think this is fair, that it comes out of cultural studies, but it was a kind of a move that that I was kind of late to the game. And so like I had already kind of moved into my own research and my own thing, and I kind of wasn't tracking the field as closely. And I wasn't quite sure, right? I also, got pretty interested in the idea of political economy, right? And thinking very seriously about, like, in the sense of, well, what does this help us do politically? And I wasn't finding, maybe I wasn't ready for it, but I wasn't finding a lot of affect theory that was helping me understand that, right? Now, I think I eventually did find some of that. It took a minute, more than one. But I this happens to me a lot too. People say, like, oh, because I used to say I don't do anything with sound. I don't really do anything with sound. And a mutual friend, Walter Gershon's fond of saying, like, have you read your piece, Thinking on Scale? And I was like, yeah. It begins with sound, dude. Like, you're talking about sound, right? I'm like, oh, well, you're right. And what I was doing was was bringing sound into space, right? That sound is one of those things that impact spaces and maybe helps us in the creation of places. So I think that I think you're right. It's more there than I'm even aware of. And I think I'm maybe moving into a position to start thinking about that in some more serious ways, right? With maybe some better tools.
But I think that question of what does it help you do, the session earlier on Black counter stories. I don't know what time that was this afternoon or morning. I don't even know. 11:30.
Thank you.
Thank you.
She said like she was there.
Right. / presenting. Right, like really beautiful work, and one of the things that came out of that session is this question about like what does it do, and there's that tension that I always sort of felt earlier in my career about like if it doesn't sound scholarly enough, and if it's not these certain understandings, then I'm not being enough of a scholar. And so I think I really did struggle very early on. I had a professor as I was an undergraduate who said that affect stuff is just mumbo jumbo. And then I thought like, oh, okay. And then I had another student who said, no one's going to take you seriously if these are the things you're talking about. And so I really thought like, okay, maybe I should read more Foucault so people take me seriously, right? And so, no, but really, what does it mean to say that we can't lean into these things and say that a lot isn't done in affect, right? Because even if you take it from Karen Barad's talk about interaction, and I talk about the interaction and how we're literally right now particles are pushing between us, all of us, right? And for me, it was really, I had a very close friend of 22 years and somebody I love dearly who passed away. And as she was in the process of dying, we were talking about like what happens, right? And so I said like, if you don't want to think, she didn't want to think about an afterlife, and we started really thinking about like how do we understand affective tensions after death, and what does it mean for your particles to continue in the world in a particular way. And then I thought like, how doesn't that matter, right? And how isn't that what part of my theoretical hat should hang on in a way? And so I think it was giving myself the permission to say that this does matter. And then saying, okay, and what are the other theoretical pieces that I want to be able to make a particular argument? And I couldn't have done that without the particular line of affect theorizing.
No, I think that's helpful. Yeah, I do think that that one can't really talk about place without talking about affect, and that we kind of, in a way, we talk about it without talking about it very, very often. And I think the point or the connection to some new materialism and some of those things too is helpful because it's part of how we understand entanglement, right? There is an affective piece to this thing called entanglement that we can skip if we're kind of overly rational, right, about this. But certainly places, that's the way people talk about places. Like that place does not feel good, right? You know, and everybody's walked into a place like that, right? Or suddenly it felt different. Right, and what you're registering there, right, is at least something affective. So I think there's a lot more work to be done there.
Computer problems. All right, so I understand your work to be the foundation of critical geography in education. Thank you for that.
You wrote that. I did not write that.
No, I'm saying thank you for that.
Oh.
Like, thank you for I know. All right, let me try again.
Start making jokes. See what happens.
Let's start over, shall we? Rob, you gave us this thing, a gift, if you will, an intellectual gift. And thank you for that. That's better. So not only did you literally write the book on these ideas, but numerous contributions have not only shaped the field, but have been emergent in your work because of your work. So even in this book, there are 2 times that I really paused to say, like, sonic ethnography would not happen if it wasn't for Walter Gershon. And if you like that sort of line of work in sound studies, that's the person to read. And I have to stop. I have to pause. And I don't have to. I've chosen to recognize the people with whom I stand and who have given me the ability to do a particular type of work. And for you, I feel that we need this thing called critical geography in education. You gave that to us So although curriculum studies has longstanding histories of wrestling with forms of curriculum, as they are related to power and agency, it still has much work to do in how we understand cartographies of curriculum as they exist across space and place. I'm therefore wondering how you not only developed these understandings through this book, but also what's next because of this book in terms of this specific intersection, without, of course, giving away the intellectual farm.
So, thank you.
You're welcome.
Much more gracious than me. I absolutely think that there's lots of room to push on these ideas, and thinking of these inquiries as cartographies of curriculum can be an important way to do just that. First, I'll just say that certainly there has been a lot of spatial talk in education over the last 20 or 30 years. But there's some contours to that map, if you'll forgive me, that are worth discussing. Those familiar with my work know that it comes from a specific intellectual trajectory called critical geography, and it's deeply influenced by Birmingham's cultural studies. What this means is that I, following those leads, have very intentionally emphasized the material, he emphasized, right? In thinking through these spatial relationships, right? This is to say that although metaphorical spaces matter, that representational spaces matter, where I tend to see a gap in the analysis is in the actual materiality. Now, I saw this as a problem over 20 years ago when I started down this path, but it seems to be persistent both in its precarity and in its potential. Some examples here might be the prevalence, if I would say often under-theorized, discussion of redlining and gentrification in urban education scholarship. It wasn't that long ago that very few people knew what redlining was, much less a Hulk map, right? But also some work in the politics of so-called education reform, whether that's charter school or voucher policy, funding formulas, etc., right? These things have a newfound prominence, right, in the discourse, and they are fundamentally spatial, right? So 2 points there, and I make this joke in the book, is like the most controversial words I've ever said, if you can imagine, right, are beyond the merely discursive, right? I got yelled at at ARA one time, and in the very post-structuralist kind of session.
I got yelled at too.
Yeah, I know. You mentioned it in the last session. That's why I was a little solidarity here, right? Where a fellow scholar, more senior than me, by the way, said, there is nothing beyond the discursive. And I said, yeah, there is. Right? Yeah. Because I could not tolerate this, right? And, of course, the example I gave was we can talk about how race is a social construct all we want, right? But that person who gets pulled over for driving while black, right? And then hit over the head with a billy club and thrown in jail, that's material. Yeah. Right? And we don't talk enough about the material, right? We might talk about the discursive, but we don't talk enough about the material. That's the fight that I'm arguing about. And I still see this as something of a gap. I see a lot of spatial language, metaphors, etc., but not a lot of material. So in curriculum theory as well, and I think it might be useful to note in curriculum theory that a lot of this work came from a specific place. And that place is LSU, right? Where we can trace important work on the idea of place and notably Southern place. But, in the risk of dangerous pathways here, but outside of a general geography of the U.S. South and everything not the U.S. South, meaning that's kind of the binary that's set up. The places discussed tended to be metaphorical, and the data tended to be literary, right? In other words, using Faulkner or any number of Southern authors is kind of this understanding of place coming through literary sources. And of course, I'm thinking here of work by Kincheloe and Pinar, right? As editors of the 1991 book, Curriculum as Social Psychoanalysis, The Significance of Place. And numerous brilliant scholars that came out of LSU in the years after, and here I'd specifically mention Brian Casemore, Eugenia Whitlock, Nicholas Inafuk, Hong Yu Wong, Laura Jewett, right? All using place and spatial metaphor to take up questions of a curriculum. But please remember, what I'm doing here, or trying to do here, is distinction and not critique, right? Distinguishing between one type of work versus another type of work, right? Now, again, that's gotten me in trouble in places where maybe I wasn't as clear that this was distinction and not critique, and it felt like critique, perhaps, right? So I do think that, again, there's lots of space to continue this work. I'm interested in particularly emphasizing the materiality, right, of some of these things. It's my least favorite part of my book, by the way, are the maps. I'm very disappointed with the way Routledge handled my maps. I'm kind of pissed, really. I mean, there's a few things I'm upset about, by the way. But that was one, and who knows, maybe second edition I can get that fixed. But I think the way they were produced in the book make them almost kind of useless. And I'm upset with that. But that was the best that I could do, given those kinds of constraints. But I do think I'm interested in talking about space as more than metaphor, right? And place as more than metaphor, right? And the experiences of learners in what I call educative spaces, which includes schools but doesn't have to be, right? There's all these other kinds of places that I think learning happens and teaching happens and curriculum certainly happens. I think there's all kinds of room to do that kind of work, right? So I want to make sure we have a little time for question and answer, but before we do that, I'm breaking the script, right? We're kind of done with the script anyway, but I think we better talk specifically about necropolitics, right? Because we kind of promised it. We've hinted at it. So why don't we start there, right? To think about the work particularly of Mbembe, necropolitics, how it gets taken up in your work, and then maybe a little bit about connections to my work and maybe more appropriately future work.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I think for me, you have to be really careful because of the argument that Mbembe lays out, although he talks to varying degrees about how one might understand onto-epistemological death and dying. He focuses mainly on how the state can relegate people as disposable, right? What I wanted to do is really talk about how in schools so many times we think about onto-epistemologies of minoritized people, and I'm saying that really broadly here on purpose, right? We see this as it gets expressed in different types of special education, as it gets expressed with questions of queerness, home language, and how we render those ways of being, knowing, and doing as disposable. And more than just disposable, but the way that it's sometimes picked up as pushing students into this white, cis, hetero, patriarchal norms and values with ways of being, knowing, and doing. And so I have to be really, really very careful. My favorite, yet least favorite interview that I had applied to an institution that will remain unnamed. But I had somebody who was really very, very upset with the work that he didn't actually engage in. So he had, by just the title of my research talk, decided that it was just not worth engaging. But then took one step further to email the entire university that he didn't think I should get a job there, and to email the school district, because I had a meeting with the superintendents, that he didn't think that I should get a job there. And I didn't know any of it, so I walked in right to an interview. And I'm having breakfast with superintendents, and the one says, I can't come to your research talk today, but you gotta tell me, why do we hate you? And I said, I don't know. There may be a lot of reasons, actually. I don't know. So I really, from that moment, and I hadn't graduated yet. And so for me, it's been really like learning how to be very explicit about how do we understand onto-epistemological death and dying, as it is connected with, but not the same as, physical death and brutalities, right? I think one can obviously lead into another. I think people like Woodson and Du Bois and Cooper in their work specifically, and Bethune, are really, really clear about that, right? But they're not the same. And so how do we attend to those using a particular set of language and ideas to draw us toward things to say, like, this actually needs to be interrupted yesterday, right? Because if we're not doing that work, I'm not sure that we are engaging in the type of justice work that we purport to do. And so when I talk about educational necropolitics, right, I want to be really clear about its connection and yet tension with how we would envision necropolitics as it's traditionally discussed. And I think that it's a really important line to make and distinction. Moving forward for me has been, as I noted in the session earlier today, like then there's this question about what are the things that we do to interrupt it? I've been reading a lot, like between like Audra Simpson. There are a lot of folks whose names are now escaping me, but particularly within indigenous histories, right, in literatures that talk a lot about resistance and refusal and what that looks like and how that gets expressed. And so I've been thinking about like what are the points of resistance and refusal that we have across spaces and places. And I guess that's it. That's where I'm going to leave that.
I love that. And it speaks to a few things that I jotted down too, right? And I think you could not be more right. And I am assuming that educational necropolitics is a very intentional way to say it. I'm not exactly saying necropolitics, right? Which I think is, even Bettina Love's spirit death is not death, right? Although very often these things are connected, right? So it is a rough line to walk. Yeah. So I thought I might just add to that a couple things that I thought were kind of amazing. One, there's a new article, 2022 article by Varga, Helmsing, Van Kessler, and Christ in Theory and Research in Social Education, which is the social studies journal. And I brought it for this quote. The quote is, they're talking about necropolitics as theoretical positioning that attends to the ways that life is dictated by the influences of death. Right? So one, I thought that was a pretty tight definition of necropolitics, thinking not everybody might be totally familiar. But one of the things I got to say, like I used to write in the field of social studies. I can't believe this article exists. And I am incredibly hopeful that kind of work is there. That is really encouraging to me. That there's been a shift within the field of social studies education. But another thought too, right, is and again, I might be conflating books, right, for you, but your usage of the term socio-political assemblage of violence, right? Is that another way to say necropolitics? Is there a distinction there that matters?
So what Dr. Helfenbein has now asked me to do is to put 3 data sets and 2 books right next to each other. Yeah. And in the next 30 seconds, tell me how they speak to each other.
No, we have 2 minutes.
That's a great question.
Well, maybe it's unanswerable.
No,
That's fine.
It's answerable. Just maybe not in 2 minutes. I think that they do speak to each other in a specific way. I would hesitate to say that they are synonymous, right? Because when I think about an assemblage of violence, I think that educational necropolitics is a part of that, certainly. But I don't think that all violence are examples of necropolitical control, right? And so I think that that's the fastest way I could say that.
No, that's good. That's helpful. That's good.
Give me a second to ask questions. Again.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that might be helpful, and then we'll open it up for some questions because we've got a little bit of time, is when I think about necropolitics, and because you may have seen because it went kind of viral on the TikToks and the Instagrams and the things, the social medias.
There's no definite article there.
Where Jon Stewart is interviewing this legislator guy who was involved in one of the drag show bands, right? Which I still don't know why people go on his show, because like you always set up, right? The guy's talking about drag show bans and why it's important to do drag show, to eliminate this so young people don't see drag shows, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, he does the classic Jon Stewart and says, well, what's the number one killer of young people? Does this whole thing. And of course, the answer is it's guns, right? It's guns. and his, and the guy kind of doesn't say anything, and kind of says, well, yeah, kind of knew you were going to say that. It's like, wow, right? But talk about necropolitics in the sense of issues of literal life and death, right, are going to be employed. Decisions are going to be made in a public policy sense, in an educational policy sense, in a what does it mean to be a citizen of this country sense, that has literal implications for living and dying, right? And what is going to be chosen to work on is this thing that we think has more political value, like banning drag shows, right? I really can't think of a better example of necropolitics, right? In the sense that, and biopower too, right? In the sense that we are going to control bodies, right? That's what we are willing to do. But what we're not willing to do, right, is to make sure that it's less likely for children to be shot in schools, right? The other connection would be, you may have seen that it was an interview, real quick interview thing, where one of the legislatures, maybe this was Georgia, I'm not sure, but basically was talking about how we're not going to do anything with guns, that type of thing, and the guy's like, well, don't you have kids in school? He's like, well, look, there's nothing we can do about it. Oh, and I homeschool my kids. Yeah. And he walks away, right? Remember that? So again, this idea of which kids are going to be disposable and which kids are not going to be disposable is completely part of the calculus of necropolitics. And lastly, I think there's definitely some room to do work kind of in that cartographic, how does that then map, right? How might we map that as a materiality?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything, last words?
No.
Okay, we've got some time. This has been awesome. I've had fun. Question and answer. We've got about 15 minutes.
I want to just, I know Rob forever and ever. We were in the same town where we both got in trouble. And you're very clearly for different reasons. But what you're talking about with materiality, this is a question that I think is so deeply etched in the history of curriculum studies, right? You're too theoretical, they're always accusing curriculum theory. I heard this, Bill Piner, somebody said, you're too theoretical, this is an 8-year, right? This is a very fraught, I think, I think there's a friction, okay?
Sure.
And so what annoys me the most is Hegel. Because
same.
Because it seems to me, and he even asked himself if he was crazy. I'm like, yes, you were crazy, and this makes no sense. And why should I care? Philosophy that has no meaning, or to use metaphor, allegory that has no point. What is your point? So. A friend of mine, Richard Pippin, who is also a curriculum scholar, said to me when I told him I was crazily getting his PhD in philosophy, right? And he says, "Don't get lost in the weeds." And I'm like, "You're right. I'm getting lost in Hegel. I'm getting lost in the weeds. Very easy to get lost in intellectualizations.
Yeah.
And that's always been my problem."
Yeah.
So the last book that I did was on the pandemic. And it was about working on the COVID ward during that first year as a chaplain. And so because of HIPAA violations, of course, I had to make sure that I didn't do any of that. So I turned it into theory, right? I mean, I talked about things that happened, but it was mostly theoretical. And that was the most material, material, and that, and I'm like, this is like for real.
Yeah.
This isn't Hegel. This is for real. But, and I didn't use Foucault. Don't worry about it. But I talked about Camus, and
Sure.
and so I tried to weave those together. And that's what Richard Pippin meant when he said, "Don't get lost in the weeds," which has always been my tendency. But there's nothing that annoys me more when philosophy students are talking round and round the mulberry bush, and I'm like, and what's your point? Like, does this even mean anything? And that goes back to William James's question. I'm an American pragmatist. If a squirrel runs around a tree, if it's a tree, who cares? I love this guy, right? He said, doesn't matter. Debates about epistemology in philosophy don't matter. No wonder they hated him at Harvard, right? They don't matter. If it doesn't matter to you, why bother doing it? You've got to bring things down to planet Earth.
So here's what I heard. Here's what I heard in what you just did, right? In moving to the last part of that statement, the important part is that you're asking yourself the question, how does this matter? Right? And that may not be, we may not know that coming in. We may not know that from jump. But it may be, but the point is that at some point, right, we're asking ourselves, in what does this help us do, maybe? Right? Or what does this help us understand? Or in what way does it matter? One of my favorites is Stuart Hall's has a famous discussion of what he calls the detour through theory. Right? The project is, how do we create Gilmore's worlds of more flourishing, less suffering for more people. That's the project. And the question, we may have to do a detour through theory to do some work that we can maybe put that into play, right? I'll also say, I mentioned him here, but the introduction, the collection of his essays, my mentor, George Noblet, describes theory as pottery. And he says, well, the thing about pottery, right, is it can be beautiful. It can be elegant, right? You could set it up on the mantelpiece and say, wow, look at how gorgeous that is. That can be theory, right? But also, if you get too excited, you might nudge it and it falls off that mantle and breaks into a million pieces. But the most important thing is to also think about sometimes pottery is about going to the river and bringing the water to the village. And he talks about what kind of work can we do, as theoretical as it may be, right, that ultimately keeps in mind the project is bringing the water to the village.
However, I will say, my work is we're so different, Rob and I, because I think in philosophical questions.
Sure.
And so I come out of that genre, and so my work is more allegorical.
Sure.
And I try to what do you call that game? Pin the tail on a donkey. It's my struggle doing that, because I basically think in allegories and metaphors and what is protecting the philosophical question. What is the question here, right? And I know there's no answer, of course, but that's where I think after Plato, philosophy went wrong. Whitehead said everything after Plato was a footnote. I'm like, it's even worse. It's not just a footnote. It's awful. Because it's like ridiculous. Squirrels and trees. It is ridiculous. And that's what some people say about deconstruction, that it's ridiculous. Well, no, that's different, because it is not. It's just that they don't read it and they don't understand it.
What people forget about Derrida and deconstruction is the point of deconstruction is to reconstruct something else.
Yeah.
And we're real good at the deconstruction part. We're not very good at the reconstruction. Right? That's the problem.
Even Dave Stovall's work on abolitionist education, right? What is being built in the middle of abolitionist work? Yes.
I'm really curious about what you did in the well and what your sonic space sounded like and looked like in the well. Can you just briefly describe that?
Well, it is. The whole. What?
You said well.
Well, yeah. Bill Schubert, everybody. Bill Schubert. So. Just one, a couple caveats is I think part of what generously Dr. Wozlik offered is that there's more sonic to that work than I might give credit to. Although the truth of the matter is that the whole reason I ended up studying that computer lab for a dissertation project is I went there as part of advanced qualitative methods with George Noblet. It was an assignment where you had to go do an observation and field notes, that kind of thing. And I went in, and the way I wrote it, there's a version of it in the book, but I walked into this computer lab, and the way I framed it was all of this activity, right? And I framed it as hearing all of these different languages, right? So I heard, and what I kind of say there is I heard hip hop language. I heard computer geek language. I heard weird punk rock / redneck language because it's Raleigh, North Carolina, and there's a thing there, right? You know, I heard all these different languages. I heard collaboration. I heard all of this happening at once. It's very sonic, right? Even though I didn't really talk about it in that way explicitly. So that was, and what I didn't hear were adults, right? What I didn't hear were adults. I heard kids, term of endearment. I heard learners working together, young people, right? Working together, collaborating. And what I came to understand was to help create a place that enabled them to be successful over there that was set up for them to fail. That's what I heard.
However, no. No, I'm interested in how the theorizing or theory makes a difference in who we are as we theorize and in the places that then we inhabit. And, you know, so I call that sometimes the theory within. You know, how it, you know, how does it shape us to do that kind of work? So, anyway, I just throw that out.
Well,
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I was talking with a doc student about a year and a half ago, and she said, well, she hadn't yet gotten through her comprehensive exams, right? So this is the point, still in classes, and she said, well, I already know what I'm going to do for a dissertation. And I said, okay, all right. I said, that might shift a little. She said, nope, I know what I'm going to do. And I already pretty much have a good handle on the findings. I said, whoa, hey. I said, are you in this site right now? Maybe this is a place you've been working and thinking. No, I just already know what I'm going to find. And I said, then why do the degree, right? Like, if you're not intellectually curious, then why take the steps to get the degree? And I think this is why, like they say, that the divorce rate, right, of people who are married when they start a doctoral program, and then they're not.
Don't tell them that.
I mean, yeah, it's gonna be fine. No, it'll be all right.
You're fine. Don't worry about it. It's the other 50%.
But I think that it should do something to you,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I think engaging with thinking, it should do something to you. You should change. Who you are fundamentally should be shifted in some way, shape, or form. And in lots of different ways, right? For me, before I started my doctoral studies, I was not out. Like, my queerness wasn't really out. I lived in Northeast Ohio. I was really I ran Genders and Sexualities Alliances, but I often did not out myself to my students, right? And it was something about the reading of through queer theory that allowed myself the permission to talk about it, right? And so I really do attribute immersing myself in theoretical frameworks to be able to be in a certain way, right? And that's one tiny example. If I were to go back and speak to the woman that I was before I started a doctoral program right now, I don't know that I'd recognize that person. And not necessarily in a negative way, right? I think we're all on this journey, but I think when we think through theoretical frameworks and then we think about the material implications of that, I think it should impact us in some way. And then what becomes important for me, at least, in the type of work that I do that deals with violence and things like that, is to know how then to care for ourselves in the middle of it too. Because as we are being affected and we are affecting, to be able to say okay, time out. I need a minute. Sometimes it's just a minute to catch up with myself. I know it is.
I think that there's something sacred in immersing yourself in the theory and understanding who you are, because yes, there's the squirrel in the trees, but
which is beautiful.
But what if you find to run off this analogy, but what if you find another squirrel that you can identify with and share that story? What if you can be a part of a community of squirrels? And through that community of squirrels, you can somehow find a way to bring more acorns to the village because you talk.
But
You're doing a lot there. Doing a lot.
But you know, I think for me it's and then I'll let you. I'm sorry, I just totally took over your space. But I think that's why for me as an academic, I have my academic chosen family. And we think about this a lot through queer understandings as well, like who are your chosen family and what does it mean to have chosen kin and what does that look like? But I think that's why this, especially when you're a doctoral student, right? I mean, I was working full time and then going to school part time, so I didn't have that. And sometimes I'd like stop into the graduate student office and like watch how much they loved each other, and I was like, I want that. And then I go and leave and do my thing. But there is something to be said for this community that we set up that is inherently, it's within scholarly understandings, right? And that doesn't mean we all love each other and get along and roses and bullshit like that. It's, you know, I think though that it's worth attending to who is your scholarly family, right? Sometimes scholarly family that you don't, pointing at each other, it's adorable. That we don't even, I mean, there are people that are my intellectual home that I've never spoken to, right? But that's the people with whom I've sort of built this intellectual thing, and then there are the people with whom that I've been raised up by, and then there are the people I just choose. And I love my biological family, but they don't quite get this thing that I've done, right? And that's not to say that it's negative in any, I don't want to it's fine, but at the same time, there are times that I'll go home and everyone looks at me like I've grown a second head. Like, what are you talking about? And that's fine, right? Or I go back to India to be with my family there, and my grandmother who talks about me like I'm a medical doctor because she doesn't really know what I do, and I'm really hoping that nobody will actually ask me to do medical stuff someday because that's going to be horrible. But there's a thing that happens, and I think that that's worth attending to also, and then allowing yourself to be shifted not only by the theory that you're immersing in, but also the people that you've chosen to sit with as you do it.
Mm-hmm.
I think I quite agree with you, Dr. Hyphending, about the space could be both metaphorical and materialistic. And what I'm studying now, for the next 10 years, probably will be diaspora space, diaspora consciousness, and talk about people move from place to place, language to language. So, and most of the time, actually, it could be metaphorical, like Dr. Morris talked about. But a lot of time, it become materialistic. For example, a lot of time when you ask the immigrant where's the home is where they feel belong. It's neither in their home country or in the host country. Because somebody like me, I'll never consider the United States as my home. But when I went back to China, I no longer feel at home at all, even more stranger than ever. But a lot of time it become materialistic. For example, if the student evaluation tell me go back to Hong Kong, that's where I tell my student I cannot go back to Hong Kong because that's not my place I come from. If you have to have me go back, I don't know where I go back. Maybe go back to Canada. So that moment become materialistic, and or if some people, I remember the first year when I was faculty at George Southern, and some of the secretary grabbed my face and called me China doll. I was smiling because I can't fight back, and I was thought, people meant well, but white people call me China doll because I look cute, So that moment become materialistic. And so for immigrants, when you talk about space, a lot of time it involves the sounds too. The sounds is multilingual, it's not English. My question for both of you, is how you handle the monoculturalist awareness of the space and the sound. Because that's what I'm experiencing here, is a lot of people have no clue. For example, even include ourselves, sometimes when you listen to somebody speak English with accent, like me, I would get excited. I think that's musical. I would listen to that person because I speak English with accent. So I appreciate other people if they speak English with accent. But that is not acceptable. In some situation, people consider you as strangers, or they will think about differently about you. So my question for you, both of you, is what you think about epistemologically about the monoculturalist of sound space and physical space, metaphorical space. Because I think a lot of scholars still sustain in the monoculture space of those sound space and physical space and metaphorical space. Because for us, like if you speak other than English, most of the time, when you in dream even, I dream in both English and Chinese at least, and also multi-dialect in China. So it all depends on what situation I am, who I was, with. So.
It's a big question.
I think though that's something that sound studies gives us, is the idea to really understand the polyvocal using Bakhtin nature of any space, right? And then from a very sort of material standpoint, how we understand the resonance frequency, and when we think about that, then theoretically, I think sound studies, that's one place that they do a really strong job of pushing back at this monotonal understanding of how culture functions. So that's why I tend to turn towards sound studies as one way to answer that. And it's not, not to say that's not the only way. I think any sensuous work, right, like thinking about Paul Stoller's work or other folks that really attend to all of those, not just tensions, but just the polyvocal nature of any context. I think it helps to answer that a little bit from a theoretical standpoint. And yet it doesn't do a strong enough job to think about not the absence of voices as well, right? So anyone who speaks more than one language, what does that mean? Like in my head, to have multiple languages sort of floating around up there sometimes, that's not always, in the theoretical framework, we don't always account for that. So there's the sounds and the resonances that are happening here, and what we don't talk enough about, we were talking earlier, again, going back to that session about code switching, right? But what does it mean to have those sounds and different languages or ideas that are bouncing around in your own head? And I don't think sound studies does enough about talking about that. So anyone who wants to write a paper, go nuts. I don't know if you have a...
the way I think about that too is to think about spaces and places, but if we think about maps and boundaries, right? You said kind of in a monolingual sense, right? But that's part of what makes a critical geography critical, right? An acritical geography assumes that the map exists in some kind of neutral existence, right? As if the map didn't have an author, right? As if because the map has an author, then the map is a text. And if a map has a text, then it has an emphasis, it has a bias, right? And just like curriculum, it's exclusionary, right? Maps are dangerous, right? They're tools, right? They're tools, but as I like to quote Annie DeFranco, right? Every tool is a weapon if you hold it right, right? And so I guess my first move would be to think about the ways in which those spaces are constructed and reinforced to create them as monolingual, monocultural, whatever way in which we're thinking about that, because the world is not that way. And even your story, maybe dare I say kind of counter story, right, is an example that even your dream life doesn't fit that parameter. So there can be folks that want to bound that want to map that and say, this is in, this is excluded, but it isn't even reflective of you and your experience. And so the line becomes, the need becomes for the counter, not just counter story, but perhaps the counter space, perhaps the counter cartography, for a different way to disrupt the way in which those spaces have been constructed themselves.
And Doreen Massey too, right? For space, if you haven't checked that out, right? That I remember reading that in grad school, and like I can picture where I was when I read that, just because that bit about multiplicity, right?
Yep.
Without multiplicity, there would be no space.
That's right.
And I think that these theoretical frameworks that we're toying with in this way allow us to have a different conversation that pushes back at the concerns that you're raising that are important.
Yeah, so good. So
Quick comment about Ming-Fong. So Derrida, real quick, Derrida has a book called Monolingualism of the Other. Now think about that for a minute. That is contradiction, is it not? Does it? The other is not, I mean, there is no monolingualism. The other is always other to you. That's hard to think, but you might be interested.
interesting. Yeah.
So
Okay.
we're over time. I know there's one more question. If folks need to take off, I don't know how y'all are feeling. I'm probably standing now between you and an open bar somewhere. I don't know. I don't know. Or a reception of some
Well,
kind,
why
yeah.
don't we?
Yeah.
If we are over time.
We are.
So why don't we? I think something some of you have heard me say before too, is what if we took these ideas seriously, right? Which is I think to your point about the theory within. If we take some of these ideas seriously, then we act differently in the world, perhaps, right? And hopefully move towards more flourishing and all those kinds of things too. But I actually want to say, thank you for coming. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.